Hi everyone, welcome to Mode Bespoke. I'm Atenas. For today's tutorial, we're going to be working on this reversible beanie, and it is a hat that's crocheted using a Tunisian crochet hook that is a double-ended hook. So you will need a double-ended crochet hook for this project. So let's get started. Is our beanie already completed. There are a couple of things I need to go over with you before we start. Starting with the elastic. So the brim, or the elastic, is the only stretchy part. So as you can see, it stretches quite a bit. But all of this crochet part up on top does not stretch. So if you want the beanie to fit you a little bit tighter or anything, you're going to have to adjust everything with the brim. So this brim is about 2.5 inches or so. For an adult hat, I would suggest you maybe go with maybe about a 3.5 to 4 inch brim so that it covers your ears and it's going to have a snug fit where the part that stretches, since the top part doesn't stretch. Now, this one is a slouchy hat. If you need more information about specific measurements, look on the pattern and I'll put the link down below. I told you earlier that it is a reversible hat, so here is the other side of the pattern. And because it is reversible, I made a detachable pouf. I'm not going to show you how to do it on this tutorial, but if you're interested in that, let me know. So here's the pouf. It is detachable. Know that it is a little difficult to put it back on. So it takes a minute to snap the pouf back onto the hat. So that's why I did not add it to this tutorial, and this tutorial is already like an hour long. But if you're interested in it, look, I added a little snap. So I made the pouf and then I sewed a snap onto it, and then I put on 2 snaps. There we go. So I put a snap on either side of the hat so that you can just snap it on whatever side it is you're wearing. And also when you wash it, you can just remove the pouf. Anyway, if you want a tutorial on how to make a detachable pouf, let me know in the comments below and I'll make one for you. Otherwise, use the pouf video that I've already got on the channel and just add a snap to the bottom part of it. So moving back on to the hat, you will need a double-ended Tunisian crochet hook. So I will put a link in the description box for this specific hook. It came in a set with a set, I think it was like 5 of them, but I will put that down in the link below. This one is a little different than your typical Tunisian crochet hook. So not only does it have the 2 hooks, the sizing is also a little bit different on this particular set. I don't think all of them are like that. So one side is a 6 and one side is a 7, but that does not match the hook in size in millimeters. So the size 7 is not 7 millimeters. It's more like 5.5. And then the size 6 is about a 5 millimeter. So know that if you're going to buy these specific crochet hooks. Otherwise, you can find double-ended crochet hooks anywhere else. You can buy them at like Joann's or Michael's or anywhere where you get your yarn. They'll typically have these, and they may have them in the millimeter size that actually corresponds with the regular crochet hook. So get one of these if you don't already have one, because you will need it in order to make the hat reversible and to work in the round, because we are going to be working this hat pattern in the round. So with the yarn, I just use a size 4 yarn. So any medium size yarn will work. 3, 3.5, or 4 is going to be just fine if you're going to use this size hook. If you're going to use a different size hook or you want a different size yarn, you will have to switch your hook accordingly. So now let's get started. I'm going to have my pink as the brim. So we're going to be starting here with the brim, or the elastic, whatever you want to call it. It's not worked in multiples of anything, and you can use whatever side of the hook you want. Pick 6, 7, doesn't really matter. Just pick whichever one you want. I'm going to use a measuring tape. If it's not for you and you're going to make it for somebody else, check out the measurements. They're going to be on the blog. The link is going to be in the description box below. Otherwise, if it's for you, we're going to be able to measure it as you go. So that'll make it a lot easier. So the brim's length is going to be the circumference of your head. Remember that it does stretch. So if you want it a little more loose fitting, then make it the circumference measurement that I give you. If you want it a little bit tighter, then maybe make it about an inch smaller. So as far as width goes, make it as wide as you possibly can, so that not only covers your ears, but it'll also fit you nice and snug, and it'll be the part that stretches, because remember, the top part does not stretch. Now for the brim, this is just going to use 2 different stitches. So let me turn it here. So you're going to do 2 rows in knit stitch and then 2 rows of purls. So these are knit, this is 2 rows of purl, followed by 2 rows of knit, and then purl, knit, purl, and so forth. And it's just going to be a repetition of 4 rows to complete the entire brim. This is what it looks like on the back side. So you'll have a very nice pattern no matter what side of the brim you choose to use on the outside. So to get started with that, I'm just going to use my pink yarn, and you don't need to work in multiples of anything. This is just all based on length. So you need a slip knot, so wrap your yarn around 2 fingers, and then I'm going to do this with size 6, but really it doesn't matter. Use either side of your hook. Insert your hook into the loop, and then you're going to pull some yarn through. So insert your hook and pull some of this yarn through the loop. Hold it down with your index finger, and then you can remove the fingers of your left hand. Tighten your knot by pulling on the 2 threads that you have right below your knot. So now let's get started. You're just going to chain however many chains you want to make the width that you want for your brim. Let's use this hat. The length of your chain is going to be the width of your brim. So make a chain as long as you want your brim to be wide. So I mentioned before that you want to make this brim as wide as possible because it is the only stretchy part of your hat. So make it as wide as possible. If I were to make this again for an adult, I would make the brim maybe about 4 inches wide. But I leave that up to you. We're going to have to start with a chain. So yarn over and loop your yarn behind your hook, and then you're going to pass that top loop through the bottom loop, and that's a chain. So let's do it again. Yarn over and pull through the loop on your hook. Yarn over and pull through the loop on your hook. So chain as many stitches as you want. Just make sure that the length of your chain is the width that you want for your brim. So here's my chain. It's already done. Here's my original hat. I'm just going to lay this over so you can see how much longer it is. Now this is where measuring tape comes in handy. So you can use measuring tape or ruler, whatever you want. So this is about 4 inches. So this is about as wide as I want my brim to be. So I'm going to stop making chains here. Now we're going to do a cast on. So to cast on, you're going to go into the 2nd stitch from your hook. So this one. Let's get a little closer. So here's the 1st stitch. Go into the 2nd one. And you're going to insert your hook. And then you're going to yarn over. And you're going to pull your hook out. You're going to leave that loop on your hook. Go into the next stitch. You're going to insert your hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And leave the loop on your hook. And then you're just going to do this for every stitch of the row. So you're going to pull up 1 loop for every stitch of your chain, and then you're going to have that 1 extra one that you had at the beginning of the row. So you'll have whatever number of stitches you crocheted for your chain plus 1. So I'll just try to work on these really quickly. There we go, and here's the last one. Make sure you tighten this last little knot. And once you're done, your hook is going to look like this. So you'll have 1 stitch for every stitch of your chain plus 1 because we had this 1 little loop once we started the row. So now we have to work what is called a return pass. So for the return pass, you're going to do this the same every single time. So we're going to do this once, and then the rest of the time we'll just kind of skip through this. So once you cast on every other row, you do a return pass, and you need to crochet a chain 1. So you're going to yarn over, and you're going to pass that loop through one of the loops that you have on your hook. So the very first one. So there's our chain 1. Oh, and I missed a little bit of thread here, so let me go through that one. Okay, so there's our chain 1. For the rest of the row, you're going to yarn over and pull through 2 loops. So it's these next 2 loops on the hook. So this top one and the one right after it. So you yarn over and pull through 1 loop, and then yarn over and pull through the next loop. And there we go. So let's do it again. Yarn over and pull through 2 loops. So there's 1, 2. Yarn over and pull through 2 loops. 1, 2. And just keep working this way until you have 1 loop left on your hook. So just to reiterate, the return pass is the same for every one of our rows of the brim. The only time it's going to change is going to be once we work the body of the hat. So for the brim, the return pass is exactly the same. So there we go. We have one loop left on our hook and we're ready to start. So the first thing we're going to do is one row of knit stitch. So your very first row is just one row of knit stitch, and what you do for the knit stitch is if you look at your crochet work so far, you're going to see these little vertical posts. These vertical posts are made of 2 threads. So here's the front part of the thread and the back part. So you're going to insert your hook behind the top stitch of the vertical stitch. So here, let me show you. You're going to go through both of those threads. So right in between both of those, you're going to insert your hook and go all the way through to the back. So you're going to skip the first vertical stitch every time. So skip this one and you're going to work into the second one. So by skipping this first one, you're going to have a nice even crochet work. If you don't skip it, you're going to start to increase. So skip the first vertical stitch, go into the second stitch and insert your hook between both threads. So now that you've got your hook through, yarn over and pull through the loop. And there you go. So now go to the next stitch and do the same. Insert your hook between both of the threads of that vertical stitch. So there are the 2 threads. Insert your hook right through both of them, right in between them I should say. Yarn over and pull up a loop. One more. Here's the vertical stitch. You're going to insert your hook. So right in between those 2 threads, all the way towards the back, yarn over and pull up a loop. That's it. That's how you make a knit stitch. So you're going to do this for every single one of the stitches of your row. So I'll finish this row as quickly as I can, but if you need the written pattern or you'd like to see the written pattern, click on the link in the description box below. It'll take you to the blog. Alright, so we're on this very last stitch, and this one can be a little tricky if you've never crocheted Tunisian. So look for the knot and the stitch right above the knot. That is the last stitch of your row, so don't ever skip that one. Insert your hook through right through both of the threads. So here you have the top thread and the bottom thread. Let me grab a needle to show you a little more easily. So there are 2 threads in this stitch, so go right behind both of them. So insert your hook through like that. And then yarn over and pull up a loop. Don't skip that stitch or it'll start to make your work a little more narrow, so you'll lose a stitch. So we're back to the return row or return pass. So remember that you always have to start with a chain 1 and then yarn over, pull through 2 on every one of the stitches left of the row. So it'll always be the same for the brim. So for the chain 1, you yarn over and you're going to pull through 1 loop. And now we yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2, yarn over, pull through 2 until we finish the row. So we finished our return pass, and this is just the 1 knit stitch row we're going to do at the very beginning. The rest of the brim you're going to work in 2s. So 2 rows of purl, 2 rows of knit, 2 rows of purl, 2 rows of knit until you finish the brim. So for a purl stitch, you'll be inserting your hook behind the top of the vertical post, not all the way through, just behind that top loop of our vertical stitch. So skip the first one, and our purl stitch starts like this. You need to do a reverse yarn over. So this is a regular yarn over. A reverse yarn over, you pass the yarn in front of the hook. So like so. Now you hold it down with your index finger, and now you insert your hook into that second stitch. So go right through that top loop only. Now you release your yarn and you're going to loop it in front of your stitch. And now you do a regular yarn over and pull up a loop. We are going to do this again. So let's try it again and let's go a little bit slower to help you out here. So going into the next stitch, right before that, you're going to do a reverse yarn over. So pass the loop in front of your hook. Then you're going to insert your hook into the top loop of the vertical stitch. Now you release it with your index finger, just let it go. And you're going to pass the yarn in front of the stitch. so that you're going to have this little loop right there. It's going to be right below your vertical stitch. Now you do a regular yarn over, and you're going to pass that yarn over loop through that top loop of your hook. So yarn over, a regular yarn over, pass that loop through this bottom loop. There you go, and that's a purl. Let's do it again. So reverse yarn over and go into the next stitch. Let's hold this stitch down. Go into the vertical stitch, so go through just the top loop. Move our index finger and release the yarn. Loop the yarn in front of our stitch. Now do a regular yarn over and pull up a loop. And there we go, that's a purl. So that might take a little bit of practice if you've never crocheted Tunisian before, but you'll get the hang of it, don't stress it. So you're just going to make a purl stitch for every stitch of the row. At the very end, it's going to be a little bit different. The very last stitch does not get a purl, but I'll show you as soon as we get there. So I'll continue making a purl stitch in every stitch of my row, and I'll see you again in just a moment. So we have made it to the very last stitch of the row, and our last stitch is this last little vertical post that you see on the row. So this one, just like the one that we did in the previous row, is made up of 2 loops. So it's got 2 threads. So here's this back one and then the front one. You insert your hook right behind both of those. So you don't yarn over anything, you just insert your hook into that stitch. Now you yarn over and pull up a loop. And there you go, your row is done. If you forget and you end up purling on this last stitch, it doesn't matter, it's okay, it's not going to make a difference. It's just a little easier if you're new to Tunisian crochet to see the edge of the brim, so it'll be easier to see your stitch, so that when you do this top part of the crochet work, you'll have a nice clean edge to work with. So that's the only reason I'm not doing a purl on this very last stitch. Alright, so now we're just going to work on a return pass, and we just do the yarn over and loop through 1 and then yarn over loop through 2 in every stitch until you get to the end of the row. Move through these last stitches as quickly as I can so I don't have to turn off the camera. So let me just work through these real quick. There we go, and our return pass is done. Now we need to do a second row of purl, but now it's going to be a lot easier to see them because our stitches are wider. So just like you did in the previous row, you do a reverse yarn over, insert your hook, do a regular yarn over, and pull up a loop. It isn't any different. So if you need to review it, go back to the previous row in this video and then just watch it over again. But that's all there's to it. So you're going to do the 2 rows of purl and then 2 rows of knit. That's it. It's that easy. This will create a very beautiful ribbed brim that you can use for any of your hat projects. So they don't necessarily have to be a Tunisian crochet hat. You can just make the brim with your Tunisian hook or even a regular hook since you don't need that much space. So you'll be able to even use a regular hook to create this brim, and it also will save you tons of time. So this is probably the quickest brim I've ever created as far as my hat patterns go. I think I've showed you 2 other ones before. This has been by far the quickest one to make. So it only took me a few minutes to make a brim for an adult hat, which normally would take me maybe about 2 hours. So it didn't take me very long to create this. And it is incredibly stretchy and really soft and comfortable. So you will be seeing this brim in future tutorials for hats that I'm going to make for the rest of the year. Alright, so we're back at the end here of the row. So this is the very last stitch. Don't skip this last stitch. So it'll be really easy to skip it if you're just working and not paying too much attention. Don't skip it or you're going to lose your stitch count. You're going to end up with one side of your work is going to be very wide and the other side is going to be very narrow. So when you get to that last stitch of the row, don't skip it. So I'm just going to finish this return pass and then just kind of walk you through the rest of this and let you crochet the rest of your brim. In the written pattern, you're going to see a repetition of 4 rows. So these 2 purl stitches is the beginning of the repetition. So this is the first 2, and then you're going to do 2 knit rows. So create an entire knit row and then do a return pass and then another knit row and then a return pass. And then you're going to repeat from the purl stitch. That very first knit stitch row that we did at the beginning of the video, don't count that one. So that one is just to help us create a very nice clean seam. So remember that when you go into your knit stitch, you're going to go through both threads of your vertical stitch. So go right through both of the threads in between them, go all the way to the back of the work when you pull up a loop. So here are both threads. You're going to insert your hook right in between both of them, go all the way to the back, and then you pull up a loop. So 2 rows of knit, 2 rows of purl. Make the brim as long as the circumference of your head. It's easier if you're making this for yourself, just pull it up and measure it. If it isn't, I do have measurements on the pattern itself, so go check that out on the blog. I'll give you different measurements in inches and in centimeters, but that's all there's to it. I'm just going to keep working on the brim. I'll come back when I have a bit of a length of it so that I can show you how to sew it closed, and then we can work on the top part of the hat. So here's the brim. I did several repetitions of the 4 rows, because it was the 2 rows of purl, 2 rows of knit. So I did several repetitions of that until I ended up with a nice long brim. This is a sample, so it is going to be a lot smaller than what you're going to end up with. So the very last rows you should end with is going to be a purl stitch. So it's going to be the purl row. That way when you sew it together, your pattern will look the same. So here it is. This is how stretchy this thing is. It's amazing. I love it. You can even make it wider too if you want just like a really noticeable brim on your hat. It's awesome. I love this brim. Anyway, moving on to the actual pattern itself. So for the last 2 rows, do your 2 rows of purl, and then we have to do a bind off. So the bind off row, here, let me show you. So here are your 2 rows of purl. The bind off row is going to close off the stitches at the top. So the stitches at the top are going to be very open, they're going to be very wide, and if you don't do that bind off row, they're going to be highly noticeable when you sew your brim closed. So we need to do that bind off. See, here's all the spacing. We'll be able to close this off, and it's also going to help create that last row of knit stitch, if you will, so that when you sew your brim closed, you're going to have an almost unnoticeable seam. So to start the bind off, you're going to insert your hook into that second stitch, and you're just going to insert it like you would a knit stitch. So just go all the way through. So just, here's that top loop. I'm going to go all the way through, and then you're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. And then you're going to work a slip stitch. So for the slip stitch, you're going to pass the top loop through the bottom loop. So just pull them through like that, and there you go. You're going to do this in every stitch of the row. So let's go into the second one. Insert your hook like you would for a knit stitch. So go all the way through. Yarn over and pull up a loop. And now the loops on your hook, you're going to get this top loop, you're going to pass it through the bottom loop. Oop, just be careful not to pull your hook completely out. And that's it. That's a slip stitch. So keep working a slip stitch in every stitch of the row, including that very last stitch. I'll see you as soon as we finish with the bind off. So we finished our bind off row, and that is what it looks like. So we've closed off all the little gaps between all the stitches. So now it's time to sew everything together. So normally when you're going to sew it, you just cut a really long tail end of yarn. So we're going to start with a chain 1, and that'll help us make a little knot here at the bottom. Tighten it up, and then cut a really long thread, because you're going to use the same thread to sew your brim closed, so that way you can work in the round. I'm going to just leave it, since this is the yarn I use for tutorials, so I'm not going to cut it, but leave a long tail end, cut it, and then you're going to thread it through your yarn or tapestry needle, and then we can sew that. Then we can sew the brim closed, excuse me. So we're going to lay both of these sides. We're going to work into the side stitches. So let me get my needle to show you. So you're going to insert your stitch behind these little knots. So when you grab your needle, stitch behind the knot, so behind the stitch, and you're going to do this on both sides of your work. This is going to create an invisible seam. So instead of going through and just stitching, you're just going to work behind the knots, and what it's going to do is it's going to create a nice little edge that almost looks like it's knit. But I'm going to use this thread. It's an extra little piece of thread I had, so we're just going to knot the end. And let's start to sew our brim closed. So line up your edges, make sure that your work is not twisted. Line up your edges, and ideally you would have threaded the tail end of yarn that you had left, so you shouldn't need to make this knot because you're working from the other side. I, however, need to make a knot, so I'm just going to insert my needle, not quite at the edge, maybe just a little to the side of the edge, and then I'm going to give this 2 or 3 stitches here along the corner, just to make sure that when you put your hat on and as you stretch it, it isn't going to tear open. So I'm just going to go through just like this, go on one side, and then we're going to go through the other side. So line up the edges like so, and then just sew on the other side. Again, if you cut a long tail end of yarn, you don't need this step. Your yarn's already attached to your brim, so you don't need to do this. But for those of us who needed an extra piece of yarn, here it is. So just give it a couple good stitches, and then we're going to start working on that the stitch that we need to create an invisible seam. So this is a stitch that you can use in all of your crochet or knit work, and it works really, really well. It's almost invisible, and if you do it carefully and you do it right, you can't even tell that it's there at all. So look for the stitch. So it looks like a little knot. So look for that and insert your needle right behind it, and then come out the other side, and then just give that a stitch. Work tightly, but just make sure that it's not going to scrunch up your work, okay? So you're going to do 1 stitch on one side. Now go to the other side of the brim, so this side. So don't work in the braids, work right here on where the chain stitches were, and you're going to do the same. Look for they're thicker vertical lines on that side, but just pick a stitch and stick with it. So then just stitch it the same way on the other side. Now we're going to go back to the right side of our work, and where the yarn came out from the previous stitch, so that's where the yarn came out, that's where you're going to insert your needle and make another stitch. So insert the needle where the yarn comes out and go up on the stitch above that, and then pull your needle through. Do the same for this side. So right where your yarn comes out, that's where you insert your needle, and then go under the stitch. So here's our stitch, and come and pull your needle out the other side. So there you go. Let's do another one on this side. So look for where your yarn comes out, and you're going to insert your needle behind the stitch and pull the needle out the other side. Do the same on the left. So you're just going to keep alternating. Do the stitch on the right side, and then the left side, and then the right side, and so forth. And always insert your needle in the same stitch where your yarn came out in the previous stitch. So just keep working this way. Pull your yarn as you go through, and that'll help you hide the thread or the yarn that you're using. It's especially helpful if you use the same color yarn that you use for your brim. So this one's going to be a little bit more visible since I used a different color, but I'll tighten up the stitches and show you what it looks like here as soon as I finish. So I finished stitching, and as you can see, the top part of the brim, you can't see the thread at all. So on the left side where you can see the stitches, I used a looser tension than here on the right side. So if you just tighten up your thread as you're working, make sure it's not too tight because it'll scrunch up your work. So just keep a tight tension as you're sewing, and you will have an invisible seam. So you can use that in any of your crochet or yarn work. So that is how you complete the brim. Now this brim, you can use it with any hat project you have in the future. It's really easy, and now you know how to sew it closed. And you can work in the round for any project you want. Alright, so let's flip this right side out and move on to the hat part of the tutorial. So make sure that that last knot that you make at the top of the beanie once you finish sewing your brim together is a really tight knot, because you don't want the brim to fall apart, especially if you throw it into the machine and machine wash it. So you really want to make sure that knot is really, really tight, and then weave in your ends. So just weave in that end. I'm gonna show you what to do with one of the other ends here now that we're doing the top part. Okay, so here's that other end I was telling you about. Leave this one because it's gonna help you attach some of the yarn to it when you start your Tunisian crochet here in just a minute. So leave that tail end there, and let's start here where the seam is. So I have my pink yarn here attached because I didn't cut that. You're probably going to need to knot it since you're going to be starting with a new piece of yarn. So leave a long tail end, and then you can knot it to this little tail end that you have here, and then just don't knot it too tight. You want to be able to undo the knot later so you can weave in your ends. So now the hat part, we are going to work in the round. So since we've already sewn our brim closed, this is where the double-ended hook comes in handy. So unlike in Tunisian crochet where you cast on all your stitches and then you do a return pass, with this one you're going to do it all at the same time. So you can't fit all of your stitches onto your hook because it's too big a project. So you're going to have to work a few stitches. So fill up your crochet hook when you cast on, and then you're going to complete the return pass with the other end of the hook at the same time. So you're going to do a few stitches and then return pass. And then you're going to cast on a few more stitches and then return pass. And then cast on, return pass, until you work your way around your project. It sounds complicated, but it really isn't. So let me just get all my stuff here in order, and let's just get started. So pick whatever side of the hook you want. It really doesn't matter. Pick one and insert your hook into the stitch you want to start with. Doesn't matter what stitch it is. Now grab your white yarn or your second color, whatever that color is. We're going to loop that around your hook and leave a nice long tail end. So loop it around your hook and pull that loop through the stitch, like so. Now you're going to work into the top stitches. Do you see these top stitches? All the way around. So grab your working yarn and go into the next stitch. Insert your hook and pull up a loop. So we're just going to cast on. So go into the next stitch, insert your hook and pull up a loop. Next stitch, insert your hook, pull up a loop, and so forth. With this tail end, you can just tie a loose little knot with this other tail end. So like that. Just leave them nice and loose. You're going to undo them at the end of the project and weave them in. So that's just the easiest way to hide your thread. And if you do a loose knot, it just helps you hold the yarn so that you can cast on without loosening the very first stitches of your row. So I'm going to cast on a few more stitches. So just cast on as many as you can fit on your hook, and you can still move your hook comfortably. So, it could be 10 stitches, it could be 12 stitches, it could be 5. So once you've cast on a good number of stitches, whatever you feel comfortable with, we are going to turn our work around. So if you're ambidextrous, you can work here and just loop your pink yarn over and then just work a return pass. But since most people aren't ambidextrous, we're just going to turn this work around. So we're going to work with a pink yarn. So you're going to do your return pass. And the very first stitch is going to be different once. You're never going to have to do this stitch ever again for the rest of your work, but let's do it once together. So you're just going to do that chain one like you normally would if you were to work a regular return pass. So after you've turned your work around, you're going to yarn over, and you're going to have to pay really close attention to the tension of your yarn, okay? Keep the tension on your pink yarn nice and tight. If you had to start with a new thread of yarn, you can tie it loosely to these other tail ends, and that will help you keep your yarn from pulling out of your work, okay? So yarn over and pull through one loop for your chain one. And now the rest of the return pass is worked the same way you work every other return pass. So you won't have to do a chain one at all, like ever again for the rest of this project. The rest of your return pass will be worked exactly the same. It's just yarn over and pull through 2. So you're just going to complete the next few stitches on your hook, and don't do all of them because the tension on the last 2 or 3 stitches, these two, for me at least, it's going to be really loose. So I stop when I have about 2 stitches. So 2 or 3 stitches, that's where you're going to stop. Push your hook over a little bit. See? left two of the white ones. And let's keep going. So we're going to continue to cast on with the white yarn. So just insert your hook into the stitch and pull up a loop. So just cast on as many as you can comfortably fit onto your hook. So that's a pretty good amount right here. Now turn your work around. Push your hook over so you can work with it comfortably. And now you're just going to yarn over and pull through two. So yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two. And just keep going until you have about 2 or 3 of the white stitches left on your hook. And now we're just going to push our hook in a little bit, turn our work around, and continue to cast on. Repeat this until you reach the last stitch of your row, and then I'll show you how you're going to close your round. So I've reached the end of the row, and I've got just a couple of stitches left to finish. So I'm just going to cast those on, but let's zoom in real quick because here is the tricky part. So once you have established your first row of stitches, the rest of it is going to be super easy. So once you reach the end, so here's our first stitch, the very first stitch of the row, you're going to crochet it like you would a knit stitch. So just insert your hook into the stitch. So make sure you go in between both of these threads, insert it all the way to the back, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And there we go, we have now officially closed our round. So for the very first stitch of the round, or I guess the second round, you're going to look at your vertical stitches. So look at these two first vertical stitches, which are these two. Here, let me move my yarn. So here are your two first stitches. You're going to insert your hook into that chain space, in between the stitches, okay? Not into the stitch, just in the chain space. Yarn over and pull up a loop. And now you're going to go to the next two vertical stitches, so the one right next to where you inserted your hook and the one right after that. So stitch 2 and 3 of the round. Insert your hook behind the front loop only. So similar to when you did your bind off. So go through both of those loops. So don't go through the whole project, don't go through the back, just go behind the front loops, okay? And you're going to yarn over and you're going to pull through both of those loops because you're going to turn these two stitches into one. So it's going to create a little bit of an arrow. So there we go. So now go into the chain space right next to that arrow, insert your hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop. Go into the two stitches right next to it. So go into this one and use the front loop only on both of those. So go through the next two loops, yarn over, and pull that through both of the loops you just cast on. So that'll create an arrow. Go into the chain space right next to the arrow, insert your hook, and pull up a loop. And then in the stitch after that, you're going to create another arrow. So here are two stitches. Insert your hook behind the front loops of both of the stitches, yarn over, and pull through both loops. And that's all you will be doing for this first row. So it's going to be the row that establishes our pattern. So it's the very first foundation row we have. So just make sure you pay really close attention. You have to insert your hook into the chain space and then create an arrow. The chain space stitch is going to help you keep your same stitch count. So don't skip that one. It's very important, otherwise you're going to end up with a really narrow hat. Once you have cast on all the stitches you're comfortable with, you're just going to continue working your return pass. You don't have to do anything new. You're just going to yarn over and pull through 2. So like I told you at the beginning of last row, you don't need to change your return pass at all anymore. Every single time you crochet, it's just yarn over, pull through 2 from now until you finish your hat. So this is the easy part. So there we go. Turn our work around, and now you can kind of see the arrows poking out. See, we've got a little arrow and then a stitch in the middle, and then a little arrow and then a stitch in the middle. So we're going to keep working this way until you finish your round. So arrow and then stitch in the chain space, arrow, stitch in the chain space. I'm going to finish my round. Pause the video if you need to pause it, and I'll see you again in just a moment. So before moving on, I should probably show you, it would be very helpful if you use a stitch marker. I'm using just a bobby pin. So I'm going to put a stitch marker in that very first stitch we made of the row. So right before we did the first arrow, so where we did the knit stitch slip stitch, that's where I'm going to put a stitch marker to help me find my stitch. As you can see now, it's easy to find when I work my way completely around, which I have. So now that I've worked my way completely around, we have these last 2 stitches of the row before we get to the stitch marker. Those are going to be arrows, at least they were for me. And now we're ready to begin our 3rd round. So this one you're going to handle it in potentially 2 different ways, because we didn't crochet a specific number of stitches. We're doing measurements, so yours could be a little different. So I'll show you what it would look like in both situations. So if you finished in an arrow, just like I did, your next stitch is going to have to be a stitch in the chain space, and then you have to make another arrow. So, and then for the next stitches, you're just going to crochet an arrow above every arrow. So it'll be arrow and then chain space, arrow, chain space, but you're going to use the arrow from the previous row as your guide. Okay, so like I said, if you finish the same way that I did and your last stitch was an arrow, you need to make a stitch in that chain space. So make your 1 stitch, so just insert your hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop, and then the next stitch is going to be an arrow. So I'm going to go ahead and go through both of these. This stitch is a little tight, so there we go. And we made an arrow. Now go into the chain space right next to that and pull up a loop. And now you see you are right on an arrow. So right above the arrow, you're going to crochet another arrow. So insert your hook behind both of those loops, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And there you go. The next space is a chain space, so insert your hook and pull up a loop. And now the next one is an arrow, so crochet an arrow above it. And that's it. That's all you have to do for the rest of your project. And this is the only time where you have to establish that very first stitch, because from here on out it's going to be really easy to see what your next stitch is. So this is one of the important rows right here. Now, if your very last stitch was a chain space, so you got to the stitch marker, you did an arrow, and then your very last stitch is a chain space. What you are going to do, here, let me remove these to help you out so that way it's a little easier to understand. So here's my crochet marker, and there's my last stitch. So this next stitch has to be an arrow stitch. So you can just work right into it. You don't have to do a chain space because your last stitch already was a chain space. So you just go into the next stitch and make it an arrow, and that's it. And then you work a chain space stitch, and then look, there's an arrow, so you work an arrow stitch above that. And then you work a chain space stitch, and that's it. So the only difference is between whether or not your last stitch is an arrow. So that stitch right before your stitch marker, if that stitch is an arrow, you will need to make a chain space stitch and then start your row, chain space, and then arrow. If your last stitch is a chain space, then just start your round with an arrow stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and just get these stitches cast on to my hook again, and that's it. So let me get all set up. Okay, so here's my arrow, and I'm just going to crochet an arrow like so. So just insert my hook behind 2 of the vertical lines, or 2 of the vertical stitches, just that top loop, and then keep on working the rest of the project. So that's all you have to do. That is the complicated part of the pattern. From here on out, it is going to be incredibly easy. All you do is just that, arrow stitch gets an arrow stitch, and then a chain space stitch. So now the rest of the project is worked in the exact same way, which makes it really easy, since now all you have to worry about is the height of your hat. So the height of your hat, or however many rows of this or rounds of this you're going to crochet, really depends on what type of hat you want. So if you want a slouchy beanie, you're going to make it a lot taller, versus if you want a regular, just tight fit beanie. Okay, so now that I grabbed my beanie, let's go over it again. So the height of your beanie depends on what type of beanie you want. So for a tight knit beanie, you don't want to make too many rows. I do have measurements on the blog. They're on there if you're not quite sure. So you aren't doing any decreases or anything. You're just going to crochet one giant rectangle, and then we're going to sew the top together. So we're going to sew it closed. Now, if you want a slouchy beanie, so here, I'll show you here the other side as well, because it's got the poof on this side, so it makes it easier to make it slouch. So you want a slouchy beanie, so it'll look like that. You're going to want to crochet this top part really tall, so make it extra tall. The measurements I have on the blog are for a tight knit beanie. If you want a slouchy beanie, add a couple more inches and just kind of try it on as you go, and that way you can see how much it slouches, because some slouchy beanies are really tall and some of them you just want a little bit of a slouch. So that's really up to you. So the measurements I have on the blog are just a guide, and they're just standard sizing. So a couple of things to pay attention to, since the rest of the work you're going to be working on this, just repetitions of the rows, is if you line up all of your arrows, that's what your work will look like. So every time you crochet an arrow, or you see an arrow in the previous row, crochet an arrow in the row that you're working on. So line them all up, and it'll create that really lovely striped look on one side of your crochet work. So just keep working on this. Pause the video if you need to. I'll see you again once we have a couple more rows made, and then I'll show you how to close the top of the beanie. Okay, I remembered one more thing I should probably cover with you, and that's the tension of the pink yarn. So whatever yarn you're using for your return pass, you have to use a tight tension on it. So as you're crocheting your stitches for the return pass, make sure you are pulling on that thread, and here is why. So on this work, the first few rows, I left a fairly loose tension, and what happened was that I ended up with these little bumps. Here, I'm sorry, I hit the camera. So you can kind of see them. I went and I hid them with a smaller crochet hook, so they're not as noticeable anymore, but you can still see them. So you're going to see all this nice little stitching here on the right, and then right there are these three big old bumps. They were a lot bigger. That happens if you are using a really loose tension on your return pass. So tighten up your thread every now and then, make sure it's nice and tight, so that your red yarn or the pink yarn, whatever yarn you're using for the return pass, that way it won't bunch up. If it does bunch up, don't worry about it. If it's a couple of rows and you want to go back and fix it, great. If you see it once you've already finished your crochet work, grab a really small crochet hook, like a size 2, and just pull through, and then just kind of fix your stitching as you go. Just tighten it up on other parts, and you'll be able to get rid of some of the bumpiness part of it. You'll be able to hide it a little bit more. But anyway, I just wanted to tell you that. I'm going to crochet just a few more rows, and I'll see you again in a moment. Alright, so I've made a few more rows, and we're just going to pretend I crocheted the whole top part of the beanie, and it's nice and big. So now what we have to do is another bind off row, but we have 2 colors. So we have to do a slip stitch to get rid of the pink. So you're going to pass the white loop through the pink loop. So just slip stitch that through. And now you're done with the pink yarn. You don't have to use it anymore. So cut a nice long tail end of yarn. You're going to weave that in when you're done with your project. Give it a snip there, and you are done with the pink. Again, I'm not going to cut it because this is the yarn I use for tutorials, so I don't really want to cut it. But cut a nice long tail end of yarn, and let's get ready to bind off. For the bind off, it's going to be very similar to the bind off we did in the previous row, except that we want the arrow pattern to continue. So on your arrow, you're going to yarn over just like you were and pull up a loop, and when you have your 2 loops on your hook, you're going to yarn over and pull through both of those loops, like so. So you made a single crochet, and now go to the next arrow, and you're going to insert your hook through both of the stitches, yarn over, pull up a loop, like so. You're going to have 2 loops on your hook. You're going to yarn over and pull through both loops to make a single crochet. You don't have to do the gap stitch anymore. So you just have to work into the arrows. you're going to be closing the top of the beanie anyway, so if your work narrows out, don't worry, it's okay, you're going to be closing your beanie anyway. So just work an arrow single crochet into every arrow stitch. So pull up a loop with your little arrows and then just single crochet, and you will continue the little arrow pattern up until the very top part of the beanie. So then you won't lose the niceness, I guess, the detail of the stitching. You'll still have that available at the top of your beanie, so it'll look nice and neat. Once you finish your round, you're going to go into this very first stitch that you made, so this one right there, insert your hook and slip stitch. There you go, and you are done. So chain one, and then cut a really long tail end of yarn here. You're going to use this yarn to sew the top part of your beanie closed. So that's what your bind offer looks like right there. Cut a nice long piece of this white yarn. So I'm going to give it quite a bit. Again, I'm not cutting this, so I'm just going to grab another piece of yarn to sew it closed. So leave a really long tail end, thread this through your yarn or tapestry needle, and this is what you're going to use to close the top part of your beanie. So you didn't do any decreases or anything, so we're going to close the top part and create the little scrunchy part of the top by sewing it. So that's what it's going to look like. Let me go grab my yarn. So here's my tapestry needle. Let me thread some yarn through this, and we will get started here with the stitching. So insert your needle into the very first stitch you want to use. Doesn't matter which one, as long as it's on the bind off row. So this part we're going to move through quickly because it's pretty easy. So you're going to go in through one side and then come back up the other way. In through one side, back up the other way. So that when you pull on that thread, it's going to create a bit of an accordion look at the top. So it's going to mush all of those, it's going to smash the top part all together, and it'll close off the top and create kind of like a wrinkled effect at the top of your beanie. So we're just going to give a couple of stitches here and I'll show you what I mean. So there we go. So that's what it looks like before we pull on the yarn, and when you pull on it, it's going to tighten those stitches up and close the top part of your beanie. So just like that. Work your stitch all the way around the top part of the beanie, and then make sure that you make a really tight knot at the end because you don't want this to become unraveled. So here, let me finish this really quickly. I'll show you what I mean. There we go. So see, as you tighten it up, it closes the top part of your hat. Let me hide all of these threads in there. That'll make it easier to see. So just work in and then out, in and out. And this top part doesn't have to be perfect because you're just going to pull on the thread and close it shut. And if you miss a stitch, it's okay. At the end, just stitch a few more stitches across the top part. Make sure you hold it really, really tight while you are making that knot. And then weave in your tail end of yarn. And that's it. So that when you turn your work over, here, let me turn this around so that it's inside out. It'll also be scrunched up on the top, and you will have a reversible beanie. So now with this hat, so I'll show you here. So for this beanie, I did a detachable pouf for the very top part of it. So if I flip this over, you'll be able to see the snaps. So here are the two snaps. They each face in opposite directions so that the snap can be accessed on one on each side of the hat because I made a detachable pouf. So I did a video tutorial a couple of weeks ago for how to add snaps to your crochet work. So if you want to get the little snap button machine like the one I used in that tutorial, check out the link in the description box below. It'll take you to the Amazon page where I bought mine. It's the same one that I use, but I just added a snap to the pouf, and now I can attach it and remove it from the top part of my beanie, so it'll make it easier to only have the one pouf for a reversible beanie. But if you're interested in a video tutorial that shows you specifically how to make a detachable pouf, let me know. Otherwise, the link for how to make this faux fur pouf and how to use the tools for the snaps, they are going to be available in the description box below. But that's it, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down in the comment section below. I also love to hear your guys' suggestions for any kind of video tutorials you guys want to see in the future. If you have not subscribed to the channel, what are you waiting for? I give you free patterns every Thursday, and you get to learn to crochet some really cool stuff. So subscribe. So if you haven't gone by the blog, go check it out. The link is in the description box below. You will find the free patterns available there. You can also purchase the PDF patterns, and any purchases are greatly appreciated because that does go to fund my yarn stash. So thank you to everybody who buys a pattern. I do email those, so you get a PDF pattern and you get the link to the online version of the pattern that you can download and access anytime, anywhere, so long as you have a Wi-Fi or data connection. So go check that out. Follow me on Instagram if you want to see any more of my projects. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all again next Thursday.